Hello everyone. I just want to say a few words about the up and coming election and the topic of climate change and how that's related to the votes. Just want to run through a few valuable points that I think you might want to take with you next week when you're making your decision. So I'm just going to read through some of those things. The climate disaster is now much worse than what you're led to believe. I think the facts are just so devastating that people just, even if they do hear of them, can't absorb them and somehow manage to compartmentalize them. I mean, I think we would probably explode if we took on board everything that we read about it. But I think on the run up to election, we need to be putting this at the forefront of our decision making and choosing a party that is taking this seriously. Because there's a few parties out there that are not taking it seriously, not showing up and not even talking about it. So I just want to run through some of the things that I think we need to just hold in the front of our mind when we're putting the cross in the box. So I'm getting quite sick of the rich politicians that just think that this is not going to affect them. I just think that they can buy themselves out of this and they can just move away from their seaside homes and that they can just carry on buying the food when the food fails for everybody else. Well, with half of our food now coming from countries that are vulnerable to climate breakdown, it's looking likely that the UK are not even going to be able to feed itself in the future. So it doesn't matter how much money you've got, if the food hasn't grown and the crops have failed, then you're just, doesn't matter how much money you've got, you're just not going to be able to buy the food because it won't be there. That is quite a stark fact to remember, that our food chain is very vulnerable. We're warming the planet 10 times quicker than has ever been seen before. The planet's experienced 5 other extinctions before our own, which is now known as the sixth and known as the Anthropocene. This is something that generations to come are not going to see. We're going to experience the effects of warming within our lifetime and certainly within our kids and their kids' time. The world is going to look very different and very scary by the time it comes to our kids having kids if we don't act. More than half of the carbon that's emitted into the atmosphere has happened just in 3 decades since we've actually known about climate change. So politicians have known about this and yet still produced carbon extraordinary amount and have done nothing to stop it. We've subsidised fossil fuel companies with billions of pounds annually. We continue to open up coal plants. We continue to go fracking. And at a time when we need to start stopping carbon going into the atmosphere, certain governments are pledging to carry on putting that carbon back into the atmosphere. We need our leaders to stop, and we need them to seriously consider what carrying on as normal means for our future. We need a government that's firstly going to recognise how serious the issue is and be prepared to lay down billions of pounds to stop these emissions. I mean, it's going to take billions, but it's what is needed. During the Second World War, overnight we changed our whole industry. We changed the workforce to women. We changed the output from bedding to parachutes, from cars to tanks. It can be done. It can be done. All we need is a government that is prepared to do it. So back in 2011, we saw 1 million refugees come out of Syria that were driven away from their homes by a civil war that was partly driven by a famine. That famine didn't just happen. That famine was driven by a warming earth. And we're going to see a lot more famines in the future. And as a result, we're now seeing a populist movement spreading across the Western world today with the rise of Trump and our Brexit party and the far right. This is a direct result of the panic that people are now feeling from the shock of seeing those migrants and closing down our borders and becoming all about us and creating an us and them environment. What happens in the future when all of our bread baskets fail? By 2050, the UN International Migration Organization predicts that there could be as many as 1 billion migrants. I mean, if we can't handle 1 million, where are we going to put 1 billion? People were shocked a couple of weeks ago when we found 39 people dead in the back of a truck. Unfortunately, we're going to see a lot more of this kind of desperation. The UN have said that 3,770 migrants, including kids, have died alone crossing the Mediterranean Sea since 2015. This desperation is completely understandable. It's horrific, and any one of us, would make this journey if we were in the same situation. 24 million people were displaced this year alone due to weather-related disasters. Some of those numbers are our own citizens here in the UK due to the flooding. For the record, I don't have issues with migrants coming into this country, but what I do have a problem with is our government's lack of action on preventing this happening in the first place. We can house migrants and we can feed them and we can send aid. We can send charity workers to soothe them. But if we continue to create policies that aren't stopping us chucking out carbon into our atmosphere, then we're ultimately affecting the stability of these regions. We're affecting their food supply, the weather that they experience, and their whole society. Then all that money that we're sending and all that care and all that charity is basically superficial. We can't keep these politicians who ignore climate crisis in power. This is the last government that can make a difference. The UN say we've only got 11 years to change climate change catastrophe, and that means whoever is in number 10, December the 13th, on their first day needs to start planning and acting for this situation that we're going to encounter in the future. This means that we need to have a party who cares about it, who's talking about it the most, who pledges the most amount of money to tackle it, who's talking about it with the most amount of passion, who's talking about the systemic change that we need to tackle it. I certainly know one party that isn't talking about climate change and doesn't even show up to discuss it. Human beings are destroying the only home that we can live in. People talk about saving the planet, but we don't need to save the planet. The planet has survived and will survive again. It's the human race and all the other life forms in it that will perish. And we are helping to fan the flames that will burn us. 1 in 7 wildlife species in the UK alone are under threat. 41% of insect species have died in the last decade. That is an incredible number. Unthinkable, actually. That's nearly half of them. I mean, when will the politicians start to listen and start to do something about this? 60% of our animals on planet Earth are now livestock. Only 4% are wild animals. We need to change the way that we live, the way we eat, the way we need to just stop pillaging this natural environment that we live in. We need to think about the future. I mean, when we sit down and we read stories to our children that have pictures of African animals in and cute little bears, and I mean, we're just not going to be able to, they're not going to be able to even see these animals in a zoo, let alone think of them wild running around in Africa. And to be honest, we'll even be lucky to read our grandchildren a story, because most of our children don't even want to have kids, because the environment and social breakdown means that it's just going to be too much of an insecure environment in which to bring up a child. The speed at which of all this is happening is like nothing that we've seen before. The unpredictable nature of feedback loops are already at play, and we could see climate basically run away from us. Just so you know, if climate reaches 5 degrees more than it did in pre-industrial times, human race will just not exist on planet Earth. 5 degrees does not sound like a lot, but in terms of the ability to grow food and live on this planet, it will just not be possible. Even at 2 degrees, we're going to see catastrophic consequences, such as the things that I've mentioned above. The feedback loops, which some people might not be aware of, is essentially, one example is the ice caps at the top of our planet in the Arctic. If they basically help keep the planet cold, not just because they're cold themselves, but they act as a barrier. Like when you're wearing a white t-shirt on a hot day, you'll feel cooler than if you wear a black t-shirt. The ice basically acts like that. So when the sun rays comes in, the white of the ice bounces the heat back into space. As the ice melts and the black sea is revealed, it'll start to absorb much more heat, which then makes the planet much warmer. And what happens when the planet warms is that we start to see more forest fires, which are devastating in their own way, but equally the amount of carbon that then is pumped back into the atmosphere warms the planet again, which in turn makes the ice melt faster. And again, when the ice melts, the Black Sea absorbs more heat, and therefore the whole cycle happens again. The permafrost that is set to melt, that is melting, also holds methane. Methane is a natural greenhouse gas which has a much more potent ability to keep heat into the atmosphere. It's 11 times, it traps in 11 times more heat in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide does within a 5-year period. Permafrost is also currently holding and storing deadly diseases and bacteria that haven't been seen for thousands of years. Humans are just not able to find the resilience to what lies beneath that ice. Back in 2016, a boy died from anthrax, where a reindeer was hosting anthrax spores, and that was released into the atmosphere after an unusually warm summer, where the ice melted and revealed this dead carcass. Much more people were actually infected as well, but it was one boy that actually died, unfortunately. We'll see a lot more diseases like this as the ice melts. Not only that, malaria, which is synonymous to kind of countries that are around the equator, we'll see a lot more countries in the north start to get malaria as mosquitoes fly further north where it starts to get warmer. So in 2030, 100 million more people are set to get malaria, and this could even spread to the UK. So our holiday is set to look a little bit different. You know, travel to France and Spain, where we don't need to take malaria medicines to prevent getting it. It's just going to look very different. We're going to have those medicines as malaria starts moving around. Speaking of which, in terms of holidays, every round trip that you take to London and New York melts 3 square meters of ice. We're having a profound effect on our planet, the way that we live our lives. We need a government that's going to help us make the right decisions. So, for instance, choosing trains instead of planes. We need the government to come in and help bring down the cost of travel for people who want to make the right decisions by getting on public transport. We also need a government that's going to come in and tax those 15% who take just 70% of those flights. We need a government that's not scared, not threatened by business. We need someone to come in that's able to make these changes. So what's the point of me saying all this? The election is next week, basically, and we need to know what we're facing in the future. The future is so bleak, and unless we vote in a sensible party who cares, I can't even fathom the future for me, for my kids and their kids. We need to vote in a party that's going to take our society forward. We need to have a government who is not going to subsidise fossil fuel companies with $12 billion annually, which is what our current government is doing. We need a whole shift to renewables and a party that is willing to fund that. Basically, I just want us to be seriously considering the party that is willing to take our taxes and spend that money in the right way with our future in mind, not just short-term goals and for political gain. 85% of this country now is concerned about climate change, and we're all trying to do our bit, and I am fatigued at trying to personally do my bit. I know people are recycling, and that's the one thing that people feel that they can do, but by 2050 there's going to be a third more plastic production, and that means more plastic in the sea, and by 2050 there'll be more plastic in the sea than fish. Great Britain has a lot to answer for, and we started this industrial revolution that effectively started the carbon emissions. We're the founders in creating this intolerable mess and devastation, and this devastation that we're about to release on the next generation. Shouldn't we be part of the solution? Don't you think we have a responsibility to fix it, to be world leaders, to be pioneers in the technology and the green revolution, creating not only just a sustainable future and environment, but also eradicating the social injustices that we see in our communities? The green revolution can provide jobs in areas that have lost their industries, like in the northeast, where coal industries left thousands in poverty. A green revolution can revitalise these communities abandoned by the current government. So I urge you to take some of these stark and sobering messages with you to the polls next Thursday. I know who I'll be voting for. This is literally the last government that can make a difference within the time frame. I just hope and pray that people are choosing the right party that really, really cares about the future of us and our kids. That's all I've got to say. Thanks.